There's a prayer I heard thousands of times from the other side. And every single time someone prayed it, I exhaled. Not because it was weak. Not because the person praying was weak, but because that prayer told me something about them that they didn't know about themselves. It told me they didn't believe they had the right to ask. I need to explain what I mean by that. But first, let me tell you who I am and why I'm sitting here talking to you. My name is Aisha Oluwaziun. I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, Riverside area, and for about 23 years of my life, I was involved in something that most people either don't believe exists or don't want to talk about. I'm not going to dress it up. I'm not going to make it sound more dramatic than it was. The truth is, most of what I did was ordinary, disturbingly ordinary. I sat in rooms with people who believed they could influence outcomes through rituals, through spiritual assignments, through coordinated focus on specific individuals. I was trained by my grandmother, Mama Eve, starting when I was 11. She didn't give me superpowers. She gave me a belief system, a framework for interpreting the world that made me feel like I understood things other people didn't. And for over 2 decades, I operated inside that framework. I wasn't a mastermind. I wasn't controlling cities. I was a mid-level person in a regional network that stretched across North Florida and into South Georgia. My specific role was studying prayer, not blocking it with some invisible force field, studying it, learning how people talked to God, identifying the patterns that made people psychologically and spiritually vulnerable. That's what I actually did. Not magic, pattern recognition, emotional exploitation, timing. And the reason I'm telling you this now is because what I learned about prayer from the wrong side of it changed how I understand everything. I want to share 7 things I observed about how people pray that consistently left them stuck. Not because I had supernatural power over them, but because these patterns revealed something about what they actually believed underneath their words. And what you actually believe underneath your words matters more than the words themselves. Let me start with the one I heard most often. The first pattern was the prayer of someone who doesn't believe they have standing. You've heard it. You've probably prayed it. God, if it be your will. Lord, I don't know if I deserve this. I'm just asking if you want to. Now, listen, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with surrendering to God's will. That's a different thing entirely. What I'm talking about is the person who uses "if it be your will" as a way to protect themselves from disappointment. They're not surrendering. They're hedging. They're building an excuse for why nothing changed. And I noticed this over and over in the people we targeted. There was a man I'll call Marcus. I'm not using his real name because he didn't ask to be part of my story. He ran a small construction business, married, 3 kids. Somebody in our network had a personal grudge against his success. So we started paying attention to him. And what I noticed was this: Marcus prayed every night, faithfully. But every prayer sounded like an apology. Lord, if you have time. God, I don't want to be greedy, but I know there are people with bigger problems than mine. He was a man who genuinely loved God, but had somehow internalized the idea that asking for anything specific was selfish. Now, here's what I want to be honest about. I don't know how much of what happened to Marcus was because of anything we did, and how much was just life being hard. His business hit a rough patch. He lost a contract. A couple of his workers quit. These things happen to construction companies all the time. I'd be lying if I told you our rituals caused those events. I don't actually know that. What I do know is that we believed we were contributing, and we positioned ourselves around his situation to take advantage of it. But here's the thing that actually struck me. Marcus's wife, Keisha, prayed differently. She didn't pray louder. She didn't pray longer. She prayed with a kind of quiet stubbornness that I didn't have a framework for. She would say things like, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I'm choosing to trust you with it. And I'm not apologizing for asking. That's it. No spiritual fireworks. No declarations shaking the walls. Just a woman who had decided she wasn't going to approach God like a stranger begging at a door. I want to be careful here because I don't want to promise you that Keisha's prayers fixed everything. They didn't. Marcus's business was still struggling months later. They went through a genuinely hard season. Rice and beans hard. Keisha picking up extra shifts hard. Kids noticing that something was wrong hard. But something did change. Not the circumstances. The atmosphere. The anxiety in that house started lifting before anything external improved. Marcus told someone at his church, and this got back to me through our network, that he had started sleeping through the night again. Not because the problems were solved, but because he had stopped carrying them like they were his alone. He said something I never forgot. I realized I'd been praying like God needed convincing, like I had to earn his attention. And when I stopped doing that, the weight didn't disappear, but it shifted, like someone else picked up the other end. I didn't understand that at the time. It bothered me. It didn't fit into my framework of how things were supposed to work. In my world, you earned everything. Power was transactional. You gave something, you got something. The idea that someone could just trust and have that trust change the internal reality of their life without any transaction. That was confusing to me. I filed it away, kept working, but the question stayed. The second pattern was something I saw in people who had been through real suffering. It was the prayer that carries an accusation they won't admit to. This is delicate because the people I'm about to describe weren't wrong for being angry. They had every right to be angry. But what I observed was that there's a difference between bringing your anger to God and holding your anger against God. And that difference matters. There was a woman I'll call Patricia. She lived near Savannah. Her daughter had been harmed by a family member. I'm not going to share details because that's not my story to tell. What I can tell you is that Patricia was devastated and she prayed constantly. But underneath every prayer was a question she would never say out loud. Where were you? She would pray for protection. She would pray for healing. But the undercurrent was always, you could have stopped this, and you didn't. And I'm not here to tell you that anger was wrong. It wasn't. It was human. It was the most natural response in the world. But what I noticed from my position was that the anger was doing something to her prayers. Not in some mystical sense. In a very practical sense. It was making her prayers contradictory. She was asking God for help, while simultaneously believing He had already failed her. And that contradiction kept her in a cycle that prayer alone wasn't going to break. Our network didn't cause Patricia's suffering. We didn't create the trauma her daughter experienced. But we saw the anger as something we could work with. We believed, rightly or wrongly, that a person divided against their own faith was a person who would stay stuck. So we positioned ourselves around that division and tried to widen it. I'm ashamed of that. I need you to know that. I sat in rooms where we discussed how to keep a grieving mother trapped in her own anger. And at the time, I told myself it was just the work, just the assignment. It wasn't just the work. It was a woman's life, a daughter's healing. And I was on the wrong side of it. What eventually changed for Patricia wasn't dramatic. Her sister came to visit, not a prophet, not a pastor, her sister. And her sister said something that wasn't theological or polished. She said, Pat, you're so angry at God that you can't hear Him anymore. And I think He's trying to say something. Patricia didn't have a breakthrough moment where the clouds parted. What she had was a conversation with her sister that lasted until 2 in the morning. where she finally said out loud what she'd been feeling. "I'm furious at him. I'm so angry I can barely breathe." And her sister just said, "Tell him that." Not tell him politely, not wrap it in spiritual language. Just tell him. Patricia started doing that. She started being brutally honest in her prayers. "I'm angry. I don't understand. I feel abandoned." And something shifted. Not the circumstances. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way she wanted. Her daughter's healing was long and non-linear, and involved therapy and setbacks and years of patient work. But Patricia's relationship with her own faith started to heal, because she stopped pretending she wasn't angry and started bringing the real version of herself to God instead of the sanitized version. I watched that happen from the outside, and I realized our strategy had been built on her staying divided. The moment she became honest, even painfully honest, the division started closing, and we lost our angle. Not because of spiritual warfare, because a woman stopped lying to herself. That might be the most powerful thing I ever witnessed. And it had nothing to do with anything I would have called power at the time. Let me tell you about the third pattern, because this is the one that affected more people than any other, and it's the one I feel most responsible for exploiting: the prayer of self-condemnation. God, I'm worthless. God, I don't deserve your help. God, I'm so ashamed of who I am. There's a version of this that's healthy. It's called conviction. It sounds like, "I made a wrong choice. Help me make a better one." It faces forward. It moves toward something. And then there's the version that isn't healthy. It sounds like, "I am a wrong person. Nothing I do will ever be enough. I'm fundamentally broken." It doesn't face forward. It curls inward. It turns prayer into self-punishment. I saw this pattern destroy a young man I'll call David. He was a worship leader in a small church near Lake City. Genuinely gifted musician, loved by his congregation. But he struggled with lust, and he could not separate the struggle from his identity. Every time he fell, he prayed. But his prayers were confessions of worthlessness, not repentance. "I'm disgusting. I don't deserve to stand on that stage. I'm a fraud." He wasn't turning away from the behavior and toward God. He was turning against himself. And in our network, that self-condemnation was something we leaned into. We didn't have to tell David he was worthless. He was already telling himself. All we did, all we believed we were doing, was reinforcing what he was already saying. Over 3 years, David's life contracted. He started acting out more. He pulled away from his wife, Ruth. He eventually stepped down from the worship team. Not because anyone asked him to, because he decided he wasn't worthy. Now I need to be honest again. I don't know how much of David's spiral was because of anything our network did. Depression is real. Shame cycles are real. Addiction patterns are real. These things don't need a spiritual network to exist. They exist because human beings are complicated and broken and struggling. But I do know this: we intentionally positioned ourselves to make it worse. We studied his patterns and looked for ways to deepen the shame. And that's something I have to live with. What changed for David wasn't a miracle. It was a pastor who said something simple. David, there's a difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says you did something wrong. Shame says you are something wrong. You've been living in shame, and it's eating you alive. David didn't transform overnight. He went to counseling. Real counseling. With a licensed therapist. He and Ruth did couples therapy for over a year. There were setbacks. There were conversations that went badly. There were nights Ruth slept at her mother's house. But slowly, David started separating his identity from his worst moments. He stopped praying prayers of self-destruction and started praying prayers that sounded more like, I messed up. I'm bringing this to you. And I'm choosing to believe I'm not defined by it. That's not dramatic. It's not cinematic. But it was real. And the fact that it was real is what made it work. The fourth pattern I need to tell you about is the one that probably applies to more people listening to this than any of the others. It's the prayer spoken from a posture of defeat. And I don't mean physical posture, although that can be part of it. I mean the internal posture, the way you hold yourself inside when you pray. Some people pray standing up, but they're defeated inside. Some people pray on their knees, but they're full of authority inside. The outside doesn't matter as much as the inside. I saw this with a man I'll call Thomas. Good man, family man. But he'd been out of work for 8 months, and the weight of it had crushed something in him. He didn't pray like someone who believed something could change. He prayed like someone filling out paperwork he expected to be rejected. God, I know you're busy. I don't want to take up too much of your time. If there's anything you can do, I'd appreciate it. He was being polite to God, and politeness is fine in conversation. But in the deepest moments of your life, when everything is on the line, politeness is not what's needed. Honesty is what's needed. Directness is what's needed. Thomas wasn't being direct, he was being careful. And careful prayers from a defeated heart sound very different in any realm, physical or spiritual, than honest prayers from a person who believes they have standing. What shifted for Thomas wasn't a prophetic word or a laying on of hands. It was his wife. She came home one evening, put her keys down, looked at him, and said, "Thomas, I need you to stop praying like you've already lost." That was it. He stared at her. She stared back, and then she said, "I don't know if God is going to give you a job tomorrow. I don't know when this ends. But I know that the man I married doesn't beg. He asks. There's a difference. And I need that man back." Thomas started praying differently. Not because he had more faith, because his wife's words shook something loose in him. He started saying, "God, I need work. I'm asking directly. I believe you hear me. And I'm going to keep asking until something moves." He didn't get a job the next day or the next week. He got a call 3 weeks later from a connection he'd forgotten about. It wasn't his dream job. It was a modest position at a company he'd never heard of. He took it. And over the next year, he rebuilt, not a fairy tale. A Tuesday, but the defeat lifted before the job came. His kids noticed it first. Dad was different. Not happier necessarily, but present again. Engaged. He started cooking dinner again. Started showing up to their events. Started laughing at the table. The job came later. The man came back first. That distinction matters more than anything else I could tell you. No, I need to tell you about the person who broke my entire belief system. Because without her, I'd probably still be sitting in those rooms, studying prayer patterns, telling myself I was powerful. There was a woman in Jacksonville that everyone in our network knew about. We called her Mother Joyce, though I doubt that was her real name. She was in her 70s. She ran a prayer group that met in a church basement every Wednesday and Saturday. She wasn't on anyone's radar for any impressive reason. She wasn't a pastor. She didn't write books. She didn't have a following. She was just an old woman who prayed. And we could not get to her. I want to be very precise about what I mean by that. I don't mean she had a force field. I don't mean angels with flaming swords were standing at her door. What I mean is that every strategy we attempted to disrupt her prayer group, to create conflict among her members, to introduce doubt or distraction or division, none of it stuck. People would come to her group going through the worst seasons of their lives, and something about being in that basement, something about the way she prayed, settled them. Not fixed them, settled them. They would walk out calmer than they walked in, more clear-headed, more honest with themselves. I couldn't figure out what she was doing, so I started studying her more closely. And what I found frustrated me more than anything else in 23 years of this work. She wasn't doing anything special. She prayed the same prayers every session. She read scripture slowly. She asked people what they were actually feeling, not what they thought they should be feeling. And she listened, really listened. There was no technique, no secret formula, no hidden knowledge. Just a woman who had been showing up consistently for decades, and who treated every person in that room like they were worth her full attention. And I want you to hear what that did to me, because I had spent my entire adult life believing that the system I was in had access to something ordinary people didn't. That was the foundation of my identity. I was chosen. I was special. I could see what others couldn't. And here was this woman in a church basement who couldn't do any of the things I could do, who didn't know any of the things I knew, who had no training and no network and no techniques. And she was more effective than I had ever been. Not effective at controlling people, effective at freeing them. That's a different kind of power. And I didn't have a category for it. I started questioning things I had never questioned. Not dramatically, not in some movie moment where I fell to my knees and saw a vision. Quietly, in my car driving home from an assignment, lying in bed staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, sitting in meetings where we discussed our next target and feeling something in my chest that I couldn't name. It felt like doubt, but not doubt about God, doubt about me, about what I was doing, about whether any of it mattered the way I thought it did. I started wondering, what if the power I believed I had was mostly psychological? What if the framework I operated in was real enough to affect my own perception, but not real enough to override something as simple as genuine faith? What if I had spent 3 years on the wrong side of a door that was never actually locked? I left, not heroically, messily. I didn't have a burning bush moment. I had a slow erosion of certainty, followed by a Tuesday afternoon where I simply didn't show up. Nobody from the network came after me with curses or spiritual attacks. Some people called. Some people were angry. Most people just moved on, which honestly told me more about the limits of what we were doing than anything else could have. If we were as powerful as we believed we were, my leaving should have been catastrophic. It wasn't. It was just quiet. And that quiet was the most honest thing I'd experienced in 23 years. I want to pray with you, not because I have special access to God. I don't. Not because my prayers carry more weight than yours. They don't. But because I spent a long time studying what makes prayer feel dead, and I think speaking these words out loud honestly might matter for some of you right now. You don't have to close your eyes or get on your knees. Just say these words with me, wherever you are. God, I'm done hedging. I'm bringing you the real version of myself, the angry parts, the ashamed parts, the doubtful parts, all of it. I'm not going to apologize for asking. I'm going to ask. I'm not going to pretend I have it figured out. I don't. But I'm choosing to believe that showing up honestly matters more than showing up perfectly. Whatever I've been carrying that isn't mine to carry, I'm putting it down. And whatever door I've been standing outside of, afraid to knock, I'm knocking. Not because I deserve an answer, but because I believe you're the kind of God who opens doors for people who knock honestly. In Jesus' name, amen. I don't know what that prayer will do for you. I'm not going to tell you that everything changes tonight. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe the change is so gradual you won't notice it for months. Maybe the only thing that shifts is the weight in your chest right now, in this moment. But I will tell you this, the most dangerous prayer I ever encountered wasn't loud or dramatic or powerful. It was honest, an honest prayer prayed by an ordinary person with an ordinary life and an ordinary faith was the one thing my entire network could never find an answer for. I spent 23 years studying prayer from the wrong side, and the thing that shocked me most wasn't how powerful the darkness was. It was how ordinary the light was, and how that ordinary light won every single time. There's one more thing I learned after I left. Something about how I pray now that I never would have understood from the inside. I want to share that with you next time. If any of this resonated, if it put words to something you've been feeling but couldn't name, leave a comment. Not for me. For you. Write down what shifted, even if it's small, especially if it's small. And subscribe if you want to hear the rest. I'm Aisha Oluwaseun. I'm not special. I'm not powerful. I'm just someone who spent a long time on the wrong side of something and lived to talk about it. And if the most ordinary prayer you've ever prayed is the most honest one, then maybe that's the one that matters most.